You blame the other, yet never once question the state from which you observe them. And still you wonder why nothing changes. Neville Goddard exposed this with unsettling clarity. He taught that others do not change because you persuade them, confront them, or improve yourself in isolation. They change when you change your assumption of them. In his language, the world is a stage and the people in your life are actors, faithfully playing the roles assigned by your consciousness. They are not independent authors improvising against you. They are responding to the inner script you hold as true. When you see this, the struggle to fix anyone begins to dissolve, because you realize the cause was never where you thought it was. This is where many teachings quietly stop too soon. You are told to work on self-concept alone, to affirm confidence, worthiness, or calm. Yet relationships often remain unchanged. The reason is subtle, but crucial. Changing how you see yourself without changing how you assume others to be leaves the relational script intact. You may feel better internally, but you are still expecting the same reactions, the same limitations, the same emotional patterns from the people around you. In that sense, self-concept work becomes incomplete when it is disconnected from relational assumption. Modern neuroscience echoes this insight from a different language. Joe Dispenza explains that your perception of others directly shapes your emotional chemistry and neural responses. The body does not respond to people as they are, but to how you expect them to be. When you repeatedly assume someone is difficult, cold, or unreliable, your nervous system prepares for that experience in advance, and your behavior unconsciously invites the very response you fear. Change the perception, and the emotional and behavioral feedback loop begins to reorganize on its own. So the real work is not about changing people, and it is not even about changing yourself in isolation. It is about changing the state from which you see others. The moment that state shifts, the roles around you must follow, because they have no choice but to reflect the assumption that gives them meaning. This is not philosophy for comfort. It is a law of relationship. And once you understand it, you stop trying to force outcomes and begin to move with quiet authority, knowing that what you hold as true within consciousness is what life must eventually express. At some point, many people realize that they have done everything they were told to do. They meditated, affirmed, visualized, regulated their emotions, and worked tirelessly on their inner world. Internally, something shifted. They became calmer, more self-aware, more grounded. Yet when they looked at their relationships, the same conversations were still happening, the same misunderstandings still appeared, and the same emotional reactions were being triggered. This moment is often confusing, because it feels illogical. If consciousness is the cause, and if I have changed, why does the outer dynamic look so familiar? The reason is not failure, and it is not a lack of discipline. The reason is that isolated self-work, when detached from relational assumption, quietly preserves the old structure. It is like changing your clothes while watching the same old movie on repeat. You may look different sitting on the couch, you may even feel different while watching, but the plot unfolds exactly as it always has. The characters deliver the same lines. The conflict reaches the same climax. The ending never surprises you. In relationships, self-improvement without assumption revision works the same way. You bring a new internal state into an unchanged script, and the script continues uninterrupted. What keeps this pattern alive is expectation. Even when you feel calmer or more confident, you often still expect the other person to react the way they always have. You anticipate resistance, dismissal, distance, or misunderstanding before a word is spoken. That anticipation is not neutral. It is an assumption, and assumption is creative. The moment you enter an interaction expecting a certain response, your tone, posture, timing, and emotional availability subtly align with that expectation. The other person then responds, not because they chose to, but because they were unconsciously invited to play the role already prepared for them. This is why effort alone does not dissolve relational patterns. You can be more patient, more understanding, or more loving, yet still experience the same dynamics if the underlying assumption remains untouched. The inner work changes how you feel inside yourself, but the relational field is governed by how you see the other. As long as that perception stays the same, the interaction stabilizes around the old identity you have assigned them. In that sense, the relationship is not reacting to your growth, but to your expectation. The pivot occurs when you notice this gap. If others do not change automatically when you feel better, then the assumption directing the interaction has not been clarified. This is not an invitation to analyze behavior or diagnose the relationship. It is an invitation to look inward with precision, not at how worthy you are or how healed you feel, but at what you quietly assume about the people involved. The moment you see that assumption clearly, you begin to understand why self-improvement alone was never designed to rewrite relational reality. If this is shifting how you see people and relationships, subscribe here. These ideas build on each other, and staying connected keeps the assumptions you're changing from quietly resetting. There is a moment in this teaching that feels deeply unsettling to the logical mind because it removes the last place where blame and effort usually hide. The idea is simple yet radical. There is no other to fix. What appears as another person with their own will, habits, and emotional patterns is, in experience, a reflection responding to an inner position you occupy. This is not a denial of individuality, but a revelation about causation. Relationships feel personal because they are intimate mirrors of assumption. Neville's teaching that everyone is you pushed out brings this reversal into sharp focus. When something in another person frustrates you, hurts you, or seems immovable, the impulse is to confront, explain, or withdraw. But doing so is like yelling at a mirror for not smiling first. The mirror is not refusing you. It is responding with precision. The reflection only changes when the position in front of it changes. In the same way, people are not initiating behavior independently of your assumptions. They are expressing the meaning you have unconsciously given them. This is why trying to fix others always feels exhausting. You are attempting to correct an effect while leaving the cause untouched. You may argue, negotiate, or emotionally manage, but none of these address the deeper structure that assigns roles. The assumption works silently, beneath words and actions shaping what feels natural for the other person to express. From that level, their behavior appears consistent, even inevitable, because it is supported by an inner agreement you are not yet aware of. Once this reversal is seen, the entire dynamic shifts. The focus moves away from personality, history, and circumstances, and toward perception itself. If the other is reflecting an assumption, then the only meaningful place to intervene is not in the interaction, but in the belief that defines what the interaction must be. This is not about denial or pretending. It is about recognizing that what feels like an external problem is actually an internal orientation. The pivot here is unavoidable. If others are reflecting assumptions, those assumptions must be addressed directly, not through force, not through confrontation, and not through effort aimed outward, but through a quiet recalibration of how the other exists in your consciousness. When that inner image changes, the mirror has no choice but to follow, because it was never acting on its own to begin with. Most assumptions about other people are not formed through deliberate thought. They are not conclusions you sit down and reason through. They arise quietly, almost invisibly, through repetition, emotional memory, and familiarity. Over time, they harden into something that feels factual. You stop experiencing them as assumptions and begin experiencing them as reality itself. This is why they are so powerful. What you assume about others rarely feels like an opinion. It feels like common sense. These assumptions usually form after a few emotionally charged experiences. A conversation goes poorly, a pattern repeats, a disappointment lingers, and the mind draws a conclusion. From that moment on, the conclusion becomes a shortcut. Instead of meeting the person fresh each time, consciousness refers back to the stored impression. The assumption saves energy. It predicts outcomes in advance. It tells you what to expect, so you can brace yourself emotionally. Yet this efficiency comes at a cost. The moment prediction replaces perception, the relationship stops being alive and starts being rehearsed. This is how subconscious labeling operates. Every person in your life carries an invisible identity within your awareness. That identity is not who they are in essence, but who they have been allowed to be within your assumption. One person becomes the difficult one, another becomes the distant one, another becomes the one who never understands. These labels are not spoken aloud, but they are deeply felt. They shape your tone before you speak, your posture before you listen, and your emotional availability before the interaction even begins. Once a label exists, perception begins to serve it. Neutral behavior is interpreted through the lens of the assumption. Silence becomes avoidance. Directness becomes aggression. Hesitation becomes rejection. Even positive behavior is often discounted or treated as temporary because it does not match the established identity. The mind quietly says, "This won't last," or "This is an exception." In this way, the assumption protects itself from being challenged, even when reality offers contradictory evidence. The analogy of saving someone's contact name and never updating it captures this process with precision. At one point, the name accurately described the relationship. It matched the role they played in your life at that time. But roles change, people evolve, circumstances shift, yet the label remains untouched. Every time the phone rings, you see the old name and respond accordingly. Your emotional reaction happens instantly before the conversation even starts. In the same way, you respond to people as you remember them, not as they are capable of being under a different assumption. What reinforces this rigidity is emotional memory. Emotional memory does not simply recall events, it recreates states. When you remember how someone made you feel, your body often re-enters the same emotional posture. Muscles tighten, defenses rise, expectations narrow. This bodily response then informs your behavior, which subtly invites the other person to respond in the familiar way. The assumption is no longer just mental, it is embodied. It lives in tone, timing, and attention. This is why people can feel so predictable. It is not because they lack complexity, but because they are being met through a narrow frame. When you consistently approach someone from the same emotional stance, you limit the range of responses available in the interaction. Over time, this limitation appears as personality. You say this is just how they are, without realizing that what you are observing is a pattern stabilized by your own expectation. The most subtle aspect of this process is that it feels justified. The mind points to evidence from the past and says, "This assumption is reasonable. It has been confirmed before." But memory is not proof. It is reinforcement. It shows you what has been, not what must be. When you rely on memory to define the present, you collapse possibility into repetition. The relationship then feels stuck, not because change is impossible, but because it is not being permitted at the level of assumption. This is where many people unknowingly lock relationships into place. They believe they are being realistic, when in fact they are being habitual. They believe they are seeing clearly, when they are actually seeing historically. The assumption becomes a quiet agreement between consciousness and memory, and the other person continues to play the role because that is the only role being recognized. The pivot occurs when this mechanism becomes visible. To change others, the label must be revised. Not argued with, not suppressed, and not denied, but gently replaced. As long as the inner name remains the same, the outer expression will continue to feel consistent. When the label changes, perception changes, and when perception changes, behavior reorganizes naturally. The person is no longer required to repeat themselves, because they are no longer being met as the same version of themselves. This is not about forcing a new image on top of old resentment. It is about loosening the grip of emotional memory and allowing consciousness to relate from a different position. When that happens, what once felt fixed begins to feel fluid. The relationship breathes again, and what you thought was an unchangeable trait reveals itself as a role that was never permanent, only rehearsed. At the heart of changing relational experience lies a principle so understated that it is often overlooked, yet so powerful that it quietly reshapes the entire structure of perception. Revision is not about correcting facts or pretending events did not happen. It is about understanding that memory is not a passive record, but an active influence. What you remember does not stay in the past. It moves with you, informing how you feel now, how you expect now, and how you relate now. In this sense, the past is not behind you. It is operating through you. Most people believe their present reactions are responses to what is happening. In reality, they are responses to what is remembered. A tone of voice triggers an old feeling. A familiar expression reactivates a previous disappointment. Before the mind has time to interpret, the body has already decided how to feel. This decision feels automatic, but it is not random. It is memory replaying itself as expectation. Revision intervenes at this level, not by denying what occurred, but by changing the meaning that memory carries forward. The power of revision lies in its precision. When you revise, you are not arguing with the actors on the stage of your life. You are editing the script that instructs them how to appear. Arguing with actors keeps the scene alive. Editing the script changes the scene altogether. This is why confrontation, explanation, or emotional processing often fails to produce lasting change. These approaches address behavior, but revision addresses identity. And identity is what behavior organizes itself around. What makes revision especially relevant in manifesting for others is that it works where effort cannot reach. You cannot force yourself to see someone differently through willpower alone. The emotional memory is too strong, but when a memory is revised, its emotional charge softens. The body no longer reacts the same way. The expectation loosens. Without resistance, perception naturally shifts, and the other person is encountered from a different inner position. Revision operates beneath logic. This is why it does not require long explanations or justifications. You are not convincing the rational mind. You are reconditioning the feeling tone associated with a person or interaction. When the feeling tone changes, the assumption changes. And when the assumption changes, the role being played must change as well. The outer world responds not to what you say you believe, but to what you feel to be true. There is a quiet elegance to this process. Instead of replaying a moment where someone disappointed you, you imagine it unfolding differently. Not dramatically, not forcefully, but naturally. The tone shifts, the response changes. The interaction resolves in a way that feels complete. This revised memory then becomes the reference point your consciousness uses going forward. It does not erase the past, but it replaces its influence. This is why revision is described as a doorway rather than a technique. You are stepping into a new orientation toward the person. You are no longer relating from the wound, the frustration, or the expectation of conflict. You are relating from coherence. From there, behavior aligns without effort. Conversations feel different. Reactions soften. Opportunities for harmony appear where none seemed possible before. However, revision is not equally effective in all states of awareness. The waking mind is analytical, vigilant, and resistant. It questions plausibility and insists on evidence. In that state, revision can feel artificial. This does not mean it fails. It means it has not been installed deeply enough. For a new assumption to take root, it must bypass the habitual filters of the conscious mind and reach the level where identity is formed. This leads naturally to the pivot. Revision is installed most effectively in a specific state, a state where the mind is relaxed, the body is receptive, and the boundary between imagination and reality softens. In that state, impressions are accepted without resistance. They are not debated. They are absorbed. From there, they begin to operate automatically, shaping perception and response without effort. When revision is approached from this depth, manifesting for others no longer feels like influence or manipulation. It feels like alignment. You are not changing someone against their will. You are releasing them from a role that was sustained by an outdated assumption. What emerges is not control, but coherence. And coherence is what allows relationships to reorganize themselves in ways that feel natural, respectful, and unexpectedly harmonious. There is a reason certain impressions stay with you long after logic has faded. They enter at a level deeper than thought, settling into feeling, tone, and expectation. This is the level Neville referred to as the state akin to sleep, a threshold where consciousness is still aware but no longer defensive. In this state, the mind is not busy managing, judging, or correcting. It is receptive. What is accepted here does not feel like an idea. It feels like reality. Satis is not a technique in the usual sense. It is a condition of awareness, where the boundary between inner experience and outer expectation becomes permeable. In waking consciousness, assumptions are challenged by habit and sensory evidence. In sats, assumptions are simply received. The nervous system relaxes, the analytical mind softens, and imagination is allowed to speak in the language it naturally uses, which is feeling and imagery rather than words. This is why reassignment of roles happens without force in this state. You are not trying to convince yourself that someone has changed. You are quietly experiencing them as changed. The scene you imagine does not argue with the past. It replaces its emotional signature. The body responds as though the new interaction has already occurred. That response is what installs the assumption. From that moment on, perception is recalibrated. The analogy of changing stage lighting captures this subtlety. The actors have not been instructed to behave differently. The script has not been shouted from the seats, Yet as the lighting shifts, the scene feels different. Expressions take on new meaning. Gestures are interpreted differently. In the same way, ersatz changes the atmosphere in which relationships are perceived. The same person, encountered from a different inner light, appears to behave differently without effort. What makes this process powerful is its gentleness. There is no struggle, no moral debate, no sense of intrusion. The reassignment happens internally, privately, and naturally. Because it is installed at the level of feeling, it does not require maintenance. You do not need to remind yourself of the new assumption. It begins to operate on its own, shaping expectation, tone, and response before you are even aware of it. After this reassignment, the senses often protest. The outer world may temporarily show familiar behavior, as though testing the new assumption. This is not contradiction, it is inertia. Patterns do not dissolve instantly simply because perception has shifted. Yet the difference is internal. The old reactions no longer grip you the same way. The emotional charge is weaker. You are no longer bracing for the same outcome, and that lack of anticipation changes the interaction in subtle but decisive ways. In this state, effort becomes unnecessary. You are not watching for signs or measuring progress. You are simply relating from a different position. The body is calmer. The mind is less reactive. The assumption has already been accepted, so it does not need to be defended. Over time, the outer behavior reorganizes to match this new inner coherence, not because it was forced, but because it is now the most natural expression available. SATS works because it speaks the language of consciousness directly. It bypasses argument and goes straight to experience. When an experience is felt as real, consciousness treats it as true. From there, the world responds accordingly. Roles shift, not through effort or insists, but through quiet alignment. And what once felt like an unchangeable dynamic begins to dissolve, simply because the state that sustained it is no longer occupied. Even when the mechanics of assumption and revision are understood, a quieter obstacle often emerges. It does not appear as disbelief, but as moral hesitation. A subtle discomfort arises around the idea of manifesting for others, as if imagining change carries ethical risk. The mind frames this as concern for autonomy or respect, suggesting that altering perception is a form of manipulation. This resistance feels principled, yet it rests on a misunderstanding of how influence actually operates. Manipulation implies force directed outward. What is being discussed here happens inwardly. You are not interfering with another person's choices or will. You are engaging with your own perception, which is already shaping every interaction. No relationship exists outside of interpretation. The tone you expect, the reaction you anticipate, and the meaning you assign are already active forces. Becoming conscious of this does not create influence, it reveals it. The guilt often comes from the belief that perception should remain unchanged to be fair, but perception is never neutral. Expecting someone to disappoint you, resist you, or misunderstand you is not moral restraint. It is an assumption that quietly invites repetition. Holding on to that assumption does not protect the other person. It sustains a dynamic that may limit both of you. The discomfort is not about ethics. It is about realizing how much responsibility perception has always carried. The analogy of refusing to change a playlist because others are listening captures this tension. The music sets the atmosphere whether you choose it or not. Leaving it unchanged out of politeness does not stop its influence. In the same way, maintaining old assumptions out of moral caution does not make relationships more authentic. It keeps them aligned with the past rather than with present possibility. Another layer of resistance arises from identity. If you associate goodness with patience, endurance, or self-sacrifice, you may unconsciously believe that imagining others differently is selfish. But endurance is not harmony. It is tolerance of misalignment. True harmony comes from coherence between inner state and outer experience, not from silently carrying emotional weight. This is where authority becomes essential. Authority is not control over others. It is clarity about causation. When you understand that perception organizes experience, guilt begins to dissolve naturally. There is no need to justify changing assumptions, because assumptions are already shaping reality. Awareness simply restores choice. Effort cannot resolve this resistance, because effort implies wrongdoing. Authority resolves it because understanding removes doubt. When that happens, Manifesting for others no longer feels heavy or intrusive. It feels clean and aligned. You are not imposing a role, you are releasing one. And in that release, relationships are given space to reorganize without force or guilt. When an assumption truly changes, the outer world does not respond with drama. Change arrives quietly, through ordinary moments that feel almost unremarkable. This is what Neville described as the bridge of incidents, a natural sequence of events that unfolds once perception has shifted. There is no need to manage it, guide it, or anticipate it. The bridge forms on its own because the cause has already been altered. One of the clearest signs that this process is active is emotional calm. The urgency to fix, explain, or correct disappears. You are no longer watching the other person for proof of change because the relationship no longer feels unresolved internally. This absence of tension is not detachment, it is coherence. From this state, interactions reorganize without effort. Behavioral shifts then emerge naturally. Someone speaks differently, responds with less resistance, or engages more openly. These changes do not feel forced or sudden. They feel appropriate, as though the interaction has simply found a better rhythm. The other person is not being guided. They are responding to a new emotional environment that no longer expects conflict or limitation. A simple example is how someone reacts when you stop anticipating tension. Your body is more relaxed, your tone less guarded, and your attention more present. The other person senses this immediately and adjusts without conscious intention. What appears as their decision is actually a reflection of a changed relational field. The final confirmation is neutrality. There is no excitement, relief, or need to analyze. The relationship feels lighter and more stable, as though nothing special happened. This is the bridge completed, not through effort, but through alignment. Over time, it becomes clear that assumption is not limited to relationships. Relationships simply make the law more visible because they reflect inner states quickly and emotionally. The same principle governs work, finances, health, and circumstance. Wherever there is friction, there is usually a misalignment between perception and expectation. When that alignment is restored, life begins to reorganize with far less effort. Assumption functions like a tuning mechanism. When it is distorted, experience feels fragmented and resistant. You push, adjust, and compensate, yet nothing seems to stabilize. When assumption is coherent, movement becomes smoother. Events unfold with fewer obstacles, not because reality has changed, but because you are no longer relating to it from contradiction. Harmony is not created through control. It emerges when internal conflict dissolves. The analogy of tuning one instrument explains this elegantly. An orchestra does not achieve harmony by forcing every musician to adjust at once. A single tuned instrument provides a reference point, and the rest naturally align. In the same way, when perception is stable and assumptions are calm, circumstances begin to adjust without struggle. Opportunities appear, timing improves, and outcomes feel less strained. This is why assumption is not a tool for isolated goals. It is a foundational orientation toward life. When that orientation is aligned, coherence spreads naturally across experience, leading not to perfection, but to a sense of flow that feels quietly inevitable. The central truth remains simple. You don't change people. You change your assumption of them. Relationships respond to perception, not effort. When the inner position shifts, the reflection follows naturally because causation has been corrected at its source. Manifesting for others is not interference but alignment. You are not imposing change. You are releasing outdated assumptions that once held relationships in rigid patterns. As those assumptions dissolve, coherence returns without force. Neville's mirror analogy makes this clear. Others reflect the role assigned by consciousness, just as a mirror reflects the position held before it. This understanding is echoed by Joe Dispenza, who shows that perception reshapes emotional and behavioral responses. Enter SATs, revise gently, and remember Neville's truth. Everyone is yourself pushed out. If assumptions shape every relationship, stay here and subscribe, so you choose them consciously, not by habit.